Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. John Rosenberg, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on, and I won't bore people with the introduction. I try to skip over the introduction and jump right into our conversations usually. So I want to start because you are, the CEO of Hebrew Public. It's a
Mhm.
charter school network here in New York City. Um, you can correct me later on as to where your locations are, but I do want to start with a kind of a big picture question, and then maybe try to get to some of the most pressing issues facing education in America.
Mhm.
What do you see as the state of American education in 2022?
Uh, you really can't talk about it right now without talking about the pandemic.
Mhm.
So I think those of us who work in public education, similar to folks who work in healthcare, perhaps, the impact of the last almost 2 years now, right? Because the pandemic started in March of 2020, so we're coming up to unfortunately 2-year anniversary of it. It's almost impossible to measure whether we're talking about the sheer amount of lost instructional time for children, uh, grief and loss issues for children, their families, teachers, and their families, and just the stressors of continuing to operate, whether one is working in a remote or hybrid instructional context or in schools with masks and ventilation protocols and social distancing. It really, I think, is just taking a toll on everyone, whether student, teacher, or other folks involved in public education. So the state right now isn't good, and all of us who run educational organizations are quite worried about the long-term impact of this, both on children, most particularly on children, but also on the educational sector as a whole.
So I guess I did want to jump into the COVID part until later on, but since
Sure.
it's so seminal to to what's going on in the world now, and it would be
Hmm.
like that elephant in the room if we didn't address it.
Right. Right.
Um, what do you think maybe it's too early, but what do you think the long-standing impact of that year of real kind of online learning will be on that
Hmm.
generation, on that
Hmm.
generation?
Yeah, I think the first thing to acknowledge is it's not just on the online learning. It's children who, in some cases, were back in school and then back home and then back in, rolling quarantines, individual cases where kids need to isolate for a period of 10 days. um, the disruptive effects of that for children, again, hard to measure, but to the extent folks are measuring it, we're looking at, I think, uh, two things in terms of academic outcomes. One is substantial lost opportunities to learn. So children have not made the kind of academic progress around the country that they would typically have made over the past nearly 2 years. The second is, when we talk about an opportunity gap or a learning gap between low income children, children from backgrounds of economic disadvantage, and particularly Black and Latino children, that gap is widening because of the pandemic. And schools that serve predominantly low income neighborhoods are feeling the impacts of it even more than schools that, for example, might have more resources.
And what do you think the pandemic kind of exposed in terms of maybe the lack of resources in some neighborhoods compared to others,
Mhm.
and what can maybe the city do to address some of these issues?
Well, I think there are a few things. One is infrastructure issues. So, sort of the new norm, and we've been dealing with this at Hebrew Public with our schools. Our schools are in private facilities, but we had to go through a process of very rapidly overhauling HVAC systems, making sure that, for example, the amount of fresh air we were cycling in and out of the buildings and in and out of individual classrooms was much higher, than what it had been in some cases. So you've got infrastructure issues, you've got Wi-Fi and connectivity issues, not only in school buildings, but in a lot of homes. We tend to assume that everybody's got really robust Wi-Fi and can connect, 20 devices in a given household. But we have children living in homeless shelters or transitional housing. We have children living in very crowded circumstances. So helping families with issues of connectivity, helping ensure that every family, every child had an appropriate device through which they could log on and participate meaningfully in remote learning. But even in those situations, people are sometimes living in very crowded circumstances. So children who we would have been concerned about in the past, whether they had a quiet place at home to do homework, for example, or to read, imagine those magnified those kinds of concerns when we're talking about children home for, in some cases, a full year of remote learning.
And what do you think? So maybe to pivot again,
Hmm.
because you run a charter school kind of network.
Yeah.
Well, the big again, I want to ask the overarching question first,
Hmm.
and before we jump into the specifics,
Sure.
what is the main difference for people that don't know between like a typical kind of public school and a charter school?
Sure. Yeah. So stepping away from COVID entirely, just talking about some
Yeah.
of the sector differences. So within the public education sector, traditionally, there had occasionally been specialized schools. They might have been, for example, a state school for the blind or for blind and visually impaired folks. There might have been schools run by county-wide entities, or what in New York is called BOCES, specialized programs, often for children with special needs. But outside of that narrow context, almost all public schools in the country are run by school districts. And there are many, many school districts in the United States. They vary depending on the state. In some states, every county is a school district. And in some states like New Jersey, there may be dozens of school districts within a given county. New York, for example, I think has something like 700 school districts, but also has the New York City Department of Education, the largest district in the country, serving well over 1 million children. Charter schools are something different. So they are public schools. And by public schools, the key elements of that, meaning that there are no screening criteria to gain entry. Although, by the way, there are plenty of public district schools and specialized schools where there are. So I mentioned, for example, schools for children with particular types of special needs, of course, have screening criteria. You're not going to serve children who don't meet those criteria, as will some competitive admit schools like Stuyvesant in New York being a notable example, or Bronx Science. But charter schools are not allowed under any state's law to have criteria for entry, like academic criteria or an entry exam or anything along those lines. So they're public in that sense. They're also public in that there's no tuition. So like all district public schools, charters cannot charge money for families to attend them. And those are the two main points of resemblance. They typically have to meet state standards in education, and that typically will mean that they're subject to the same state assessment requirements on state exams, usually in English language arts and math, as other district schools. But they also, and this is a critical difference now, and I'll turn to differences here, they operate under a charter. And a charter is essentially a contract between the school and an entity that has authority under state law to grant charters. Since you're in New York, and we're talking nationally here, but in the context of New York, to give an example, there are 3 entities in New York that have the authority to grant charters. The New York State Board of Regents, which sits over the New York State Education Department, the board of the State University of New York, and the New York City Department of Education, which can only grant charters for New York City. When schools are granted a charter, it's typically for a period of 5 years, and then you have to apply to get renewed. And so one of the differences is, depending on how well run a given state's or charter authorizer's operation is, they will hold schools' feet to the fire, and schools that are like sort of chronically or consistently underperforming or financially mismanaged get closed down, which is very hard to do in a district context, but is part of the makeup of the charter school sector. The other thing is, charters are not governed then by a district. They may have a relationship with the district. This gets complicated under state law, but they are typically governed by a board that is a nonprofit organizational board. So, for example, each of our schools in New York has its own nonprofit board that manages that school, and in turn contracts with my organization, Hebrew Public, to help run the school on their behalf. Those are the chief differences between charter schools and district schools. It's also often noted, and often a real political issue, that charter schools are typically non-unionized in terms of their teacher workforce. Not always. There's actually a bunch of exceptions, but typically non-unionized, whereas district schools are often unionized. Again, varies a lot from state to state.
Yeah, what's interesting about I spent my whole life kind of attending public schools,
Mhm,
in Brooklyn, and then in college I also went to a CUNY, which is a city school.
mhm.
Um,
Which CUNY
what's
campus, if I might ask?
Baruch.
Baruch. Okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
know it well. Sure.
So what's interesting to me is that I feel like the onus has become more and more on the parents to now, and I feel like it's a very difficult decision, and
Mhm.
that's very pressure filled, because you have to make the best decision for your child, and there are so many options. And I feel like, I don't think when I was growing up, at least,
Yeah.
which was not that long ago. um
I was going to say,
uh yeah,
couldn't have been too long ago
no,
looking at you. Go ahead.
back in my
Uh,
day. But
right,
it's I didn't see that many charter schools in New York City, and
right.
like I don't think it even crossed my parents' mind to
Well, the whole
put.
charter school movement is not a whole lot more than 20 or 25 years old.
Right.
I forget the date that in Minnesota the first charter school opened, but so this is still a pretty new sector in terms of public education. It's grown rapidly. So there are about 7,500 charter schools around the country. They collectively enroll about 3 million kids. I think it's about 6 or 6.5% of total public school enrollment in the United States, but that's still pretty small. It sounds like huge numbers, right?
Yeah.
7,500, but relative, and there are states that don't have charter laws at all. Again, charters are not a federal creation. The feds support charters through a competitive grant program, but most of the funding is really state funding. Uh, when I was growing up, which was long before you were growing up, yeah, you really had one choice if you were going to public school. It was usually the zoned neighborhood school in the
Mhm.
district that you lived in. And each school had a catchment area, and you went to a school based on your address. Increasingly, a lot of districts, particularly some of the bigger districts, are beginning to shift away from that. And even at the time when you were growing up, there were things called magnet schools, which often have a special theme. My wife, for example, went to the High School for the Performing Arts in New York City, the famed school, many, many years ago. And that was a school you had to audition for.
Right.
But it was essentially a magnet school for children with a specialized theme. And so outside of those kinds of magnet school contexts or specialized school contexts, yeah, for elementary in particular, it was almost always determined by where you lived. In New York, though, even before the rise of the charter school sector, at the high school level, there's been high school choice for a pretty long time, and the gradual breakup of what used to be called these very large comprehensive high schools. When I was growing up, New York City had high schools with 4,000, 3,000 students, and that's increasingly not the case.
Yeah.
And there's a very widespread high school for the 300 or so high schools in New York. Kids can apply to any of them based on different criteria. And so there's a lot of choice at that level.
Yeah. Well, I went to a high school that had, I think, well over 3,000 kids in the school. Um,
Midwood or
Midwood, yeah,
yeah,
Midwood.
yeah, yeah.
So, but I think, again, I was trying to uh, say that now parents have like this difficult decision to make, and they have to weigh a lot of options. I think,
So
especially in your.
choice can be overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Choice can be, America as a sort of consumerist country. People who come here from some other countries, right? I can't believe there's like 50 brands of peanut butter, right?
Yeah.
How many different cereals, how many different types of milk, how many, the list goes on and on. Toilet paper, right? It's not just one brand of toilet paper. There's God knows how many.
Right. Right.
So choice can be daunting. And a lot of the districts that have been, and cities that have been thoughtful about this will have choice guides, right? A guide to New York City high school selection, a guide to different kinds of charter schools, for example, a common application where you can select schools across a menu, both charter and district, again, depending on the city. There are also, I think, fair critiques of choice in that people who have more education, more resources, people for whom English might be the first language, people who are well networked, are more apt to be able to exercise meaningful choice than people who might not have access to those information resources. And this is one of those areas where any school that one has to choose to apply to has to do a lot of work to promote itself, not only to people who might know about it already or have heard about it through their neighborhood or newspaper or whatever, but to folks who are in situations, for example, recent immigrants or people in neighborhoods that are really resource starved, to make sure that they hear about your school as well.
Mhm. Right. And how do you? I think this is an important question when talking to somebody that runs again the charter school network. How did
Mhm.
your kind of upbringing? Uh, I don't know if it did. Maybe I assume it did shape what you ended up doing and kind
Sure.
of
Yeah.
and working in the charter school
I mean, I'll give
world.
the short version, I guess. My dad is a social worker, now semi-retired, and worked as a hospital administrator and did a lot of work around helping communities, particularly the East Harlem community, around issues of community development and healthcare. My mother and stepfather were public school teachers in Brooklyn. At one point in time, both working at Thomas Jefferson High School in East New York, and I came through public schools in Queens and on Long Island. Um, I started out, uh, I went to law school wanting to do public interest law, public service law. And after a stint as a public defender at the Legal Aid Society, I got really interested in educational equity issues and discrimination in education, and worked as an education civil rights lawyer for the federal government for several years.
Mm.
That got me really deeply involved in what it took to try to reform school districts and school district practice, including around things like the over placement of Black boys in self-contained special education programs, or the use of criteria that really were not educationally appropriate to determine who gets to take high-level math or science courses, or who's in a gifted program. Uh, so once I started down that path, which was in 1995, there really was no looking back for me. Almost all of my work experience since then, other than a several-year stint running a different organization, almost all of it's been in education, in public education, and in around issues of educational equity, first as an education lawyer, and then as someone who runs nonprofit organizations.
Can you elaborate on the points you just made about the criteria to get into different programs and whatnot, and how they were unfair? Or can
Right.
you elaborate on that?
So it's actually, I mean, one of the big issues right now is very much in the news and very controversial, which surrounds the longstanding practice of placing kindergarten students at point of entry into gifted programs in New York City district elementary schools, based in the past on a single test. And there's a lot of politics involved in why that happens. Similar to, so reforming a system like that, which I'm happy to share more about why I think it's problematic, is very similar to attempting to change the attendance zones in a district where two nearby schools might be each be segregated in a different way, right? Trying to combine those populations also leads to lots of political and community-based furor, backlash. Um, Education, where one's children go and what kind of program opportunities they have, is one of those situations where people understandably advocate for the best thing for their child, and that's often in tension with issues of equity or fairness. Um, we want to have great education for everybody. We want every child to be able to thrive and stretch and reach their full potential. But it's often seen as a zero-sum game. And that's very much an issue in terms of where children go to school and what kinds of programs they gain access to.
Yeah. But so to that point, what do you think entails a quote unquote good education?
Well, that's a big question.
Mhm.
Uh, for me, a few things. Literacy is critical. You can't function civically, professionally, in the workforce in any meaningful way, just as a person who is able to learn, right? Whatever one chooses to learn, uh, without being highly literate. And this continues to be an area where our educational system does not deliver consistently high results. Numeracy, math. I don't have a particular opinion about what level of math skills someone needs to attain through their public education, but certainly mastery of what I would call sort of basic to intermediate level math is a necessity, again, in this world. Above and beyond those, there are a few other things. And for me and for the work of our schools, this is particularly important in the current moment. So there's a lot of talk in the last few years about what folks call social and emotional skills or social emotional learning. And these range in terms of the definitions that sit underneath that, but things like self-regulation and the ability to have executive function and interpersonal skills and empathy. And in the past, people thought these things weren't necessarily teachable, but to some extent they are. And there are also questions about how one goes about measuring them. Right? We don't have the same kind of standardized tests yet, and I'm not so sure we should. But having people who are emotionally capable and have a set of social skills that enable them to do things like work in groups, for example, right, is critical. And then the last piece for me fits under a rubric, what in my organization we call global citizenship, as do a number of other folks out there. But here, what I really mean is we're living in a time where people are more divided than ever. And a lot of that division has to do with people not being skilled at cross-cultural communication, people not exercising their empathy muscles, people buying into narratives that are blinkered and often hate-filled, and people not developing their critical thinking skills. So countering that, whatever one's politics, being in a world where children, as they move through school, develop the ability to keep an open mind, to weigh evidence and think about the sources of evidence, to solve problems creatively, to make efforts to communicate thoughtfully and to listen to people around them. Right? That set of skills, I think, are a critical part of a K-12 education. And I think we have a collective responsibility to help children develop them.
And how do you develop them?
Well, it's hard because schools are trying to balance an enormous number of things. In our schools, for example, schools and organizations often have a set of values that they use. We have Hebrew as a second language of instruction. So we have an acronym, Olam, which is the Hebrew word for world, that stands for, and I'll go one letter at a time, outstanding problem solving is the O, lifelong learning, aware communication, again, collectively through those, making a difference, which is the M. And that's reflected in awards and ceremonies. It's reflected in lesson plans and how teachers might recognize what a student does or encourage a group of students. And increasingly, as kids move into the upper grade levels, we are trying to build that into things like our Israel Studies program, as well as into our Harlem Hebrew School, our Harlem Studies program, and really just always be thinking about ways. So for example, if two students are having an interaction and they're in conflict with each other, and the conflict involves one not listening to the other and one making assumptions about the other, you have opportunities to call that out and to model something different. Positive modeling on the part of educators, and then recognizing that in children is one of the ways you help folks develop those muscles. So this includes things like mediating between differences and helping children develop that set of skills. Whereas a lot of kids come from backgrounds where their lives are rife with conflict. And so what does it mean to actually be able to take a step back and be thoughtful and empathetic and have a problem-solving orientation and then resolve that conflict? That's critical. You can be literate and numerate and still not be able to do those things. You're going to struggle in life, and collectively, we will struggle as a society.
Right. And what do you view as the role, for example, for like curriculums in elementary schools? For I know we usually like to emphasize the testable subjects such as
Sure.
English, the literacy rate, and math, and
Right.
something that
Right.
could clearly be tested. And I think that could be at the expense of other subjects that are
For
maybe
sure.
not tested. And do you emphasize, for
Right.
example, in your schools, and do you think it's important, for example, to learn history or science and
Right. Right.
in at an early age, so that when they get to high
Yeah.
school, they they have these skills to take in that kind of information?
Yeah, so we have social studies and science curricula that we use, and that in fact schools are still required to teach those subjects, and depending on the state to teach them at every grade level. But you're also right that when the No Child Left Behind Act was passed many years ago, it created. Let me take a step back here. Anytime you make a big public policy or big programmatic decision, at the country level, state level, or city, district level, um, it will have a set of unintended consequences, even if the thing was really well intended. And so the decision by the federal government to make federal funding contingent on state assessments, annualized standardized assessments in grades 3 through 8 in math and in English, I think on balance was the right thing to do. It exposed gaps in learning between have and have not, between white children and children of color, between wealthy children and non-wealthy children, between good schools and bad schools, and directed a lot of reform energy towards trying to remedy that situation. But it also undeniably, when you're held accountable for just a couple of things and everything else starts to potentially fall by the wayside or decay a little bit. So lots of folks have bemoaned reductions in funding over a period of years to art programs, to music curriculum, right, to physical education. I think the pendulum's started to swing back a little bit. In our schools, we certainly try to balance and have a breadth of curriculum. I also think that you can get at a lot of critical thinking skills through math. You can get at a lot of social and emotional skills in any subject through kids working together to solve problems, but also you can get at a lot of historical and social context learning through reading novels, through reading short stories, through engaging with literature, in other words, right? So English, the richness of the text can tie into math, science, social studies, history, geography, you name it. And so I think that the challenge, I would say, is almost a different one. The challenge is when you have such a diverse group of learners in any classroom coming from all different kinds of backgrounds, as we have in our schools, and there's a teacher with that class, maybe a special educator also, maybe a paraprofessional, but oftentimes just one teacher. How does that teacher get all this content across in ways where every child is learning at a significant level? And that challenge, I think, creates issues around breadth and depth of learning, because our educational model is still kind of antiquated in this respect.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of leads to another question. Is there a better way to get I'm not sure best and brightest is the right term, but maybe the most willing students coming out of college to go teach for a couple of years in any
Right.
school, and not make it easier, but incentivize in different ways to have more qualified teachers. And then I think the main problem that I think education as a whole has in the United States is the
Mhm.
fact that we're not retaining our teachers. Is teachers seem to be like staying for a year or two and then leaving
A
elsewhere.
significant percentage, a very
Yeah.
significant
So
percentage, leave within the first 3 to 5 years.
right. So that
Yeah,
seems to me like
yeah,
a problem, and I
that's a
think
huge problem.
so.
Yeah.
And I think that can have long-standing impact on kids' development and kids' knowledge base, and from elementary school to
When you think about teacher quality, never mind vacancies,
sure.
but teacher quality, there's a lot of data out there, big studies, longitudinal studies, that for example, the impact of having a great teacher 2 years in a row versus having a not great teacher 2 years in a row is months and months of learning. The difference. You mentioned, can we find ways to create buzz among, great, intelligent, driven college grads? That's what Teach for America is, and it's 20 some odd years old. It did bring a lot of energy and a lot of controversy, but a lot of energy and a lot of talented folks into education. A lot of them didn't stay past their first 2 years of teaching once they met that commitment, although many of them continued into other kinds of educational roles, or became animated around educational equity in careers in politics or business or other nonprofit sectors. And many of them did stay as teachers, but it hasn't on its own. Programs like Teach for America solved the pipeline issue, nor the retention issue, the holding on to people. And that's a tough one. And right now, uh, we're looking at this moment in time because of the pandemic, what folks are calling the Great Resignation. And so the issues around teacher attrition and the challenges in hiring teachers have never been, in my career, as profound as they are right now. But you did also have some sustained efforts to bring folks into the workforce, Teach for America being one, but another one is a program called 100K in 10, that was developed and run by a woman named Talia Milgram Elcott that was focused on STEM teachers, science, technology, engineering, and math teachers, and was this what's called a collective impact effort over a number of years, where this organization, 100K in 10, kind of organization / project, organized foundations and government agencies and schools of education and major districts and a whole bunch of other folks for the idea of specifically creating a pipeline to bring lots and lots, thousands and thousands of new teachers in within those areas, which are often among the hardest to staff for. And it's been successful. So there are hopeful initiatives out there, but they require a lot of smarts and a lot of sustained effort in funding.
How do you as a person that runs a school kind of try to incentivize for teachers to stay? Is there a main kind of complaint that you hear very often when a teacher leaves? Is it work environment? Is it, well, it could be
It's a
obviously
whole
for some,
bunch. It's a whole
for
bunch of things. Yeah.
for some people it's the pandemic now, right? They don't want to be
Pandemic
around.
has taken a toll. I'd say if we pulled back from the pandemic and said, what in a quote normal year, the things that we've seen, and that when I talk to teachers one-on-one that I hear about, and also I think in the literature, compensation is certainly important. It's actually not the only thing, but I think that there's sometimes this thing about, oh, teachers, they're not doing it for the money. Everyone needs to make a living, and so there are issues certainly around teacher compensation. We need to pay teachers better collectively as a nation. But separate and apart from that, career development opportunities. Do I have a promotion path available to me? Can I take on roles of specialization? Can I eventually become a dean or a coach or a grade level lead or a head of school or a superintendent or a chief academic officer? Do I have opportunities separate perhaps from promotion to just continue to learn? Is my school what's called a professional learning community where teachers collaborate and brainstorm together and up each other's game? Do I have opportunities to take courses or go to conferences and meet with peers? Those things are significant. Working conditions for sure. Politicians argue about whether teachers are underworked or overworked. Good teachers are overworked. Teachers who are not committed to the profession don't work as hard, as is true in most professions. So it's a mistake to focus on the hours that someone's in a building. But if someone is not going above and beyond or really taking their commitment as a teacher seriously to their children and to their work, they may just work the hours they're in the building and even then may not work that hard. Other folks might be working weekends and evenings and late afternoons and early, and it can be a crushing set of responsibilities. But I also think sort of the culture of a school. Do folks feel supported? Do they feel like there are supervisors or peers that they can go to for coaching, for advice? Does the school have a warm, supportive culture for adults and children and families? Those things also, I think, make a huge difference.
Out of that, two questions that might seem separate, and you can address them a little separately.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been discussing teacher quality, teacher retention. The first kind of question I have is, we haven't really addressed what makes a good teacher. What is a good teacher? Is it the test scores that their students get, or is there some kind of intangible or tangible quality that teachers have that make them the good teacher? And I think if we go through our own lives, right, we have maybe a few teachers through
Right.
elementary school,
Sure.
high school, middle school,
Yeah.
that kind of shaped our way of
Right.
thinking.
Yes.
So that's how I would define a good teacher, someone
I
that
mean,
made me
there are
think.
a lot. So you said it, you came at it sort of from a couple of different directions. You could say, what are the characteristics of a good teacher? Or you could say, what are the outcomes of having a good teacher? So if you're talking about things like children learning a lot as measured by standardized tests, you could view that as an output, right? An outcome from good teaching. Um, you could use a whole bunch of other things, like, did this teacher have an impact on me, right? Those beg the question of what made that person a good teacher. In other words, I can say, without even thinking about it, who the best teachers were that I had, as you said, elementary, middle, high school, college. But I'd have to stop and think, if you said, what was it that made them such a good teacher? And it's not always the same thing for the different folks I'm talking about. There are a few things that are common, I would say, to every, irrespective of whether somebody yields high test scores for their kids or whatever, some things that I think are non-negotiable for someone to really be considered an excellent teacher. One is they have to know their content. You could be, think of a professor that you had, let's just name a subject where you had a great professor in college.
Oh, whew, man, a few history courses I took.
Okay, history. I had a feeling you were going to say history. So let's say that history professor, the next school year, was assigned calculus to teach.
I doubt
Would they
would
be a good
good.
calculus teacher?
I doubt it.
Maybe if they spend 10 years learning, but if they were just dropped in the next year, whatever wonderful characteristics they might have as a teacher, they have to know their content. And so the really mastery of content is critical, and an area where a lot of teachers struggle, depending on what their assignment is and what their educational background is. A second is having uniformly high expectations of children. And I want to be clear about what I mean and what I don't mean by that. That doesn't mean having a toxically rigid set of expectations where children are scorned or punished or mocked for not meeting them. It means that the teacher has a determined belief that every child can grow academically significantly, regardless of where they started that school year, or regardless of historically. And that teacher will work tenaciously, hopefully with peers. Hopefully it's the kind of environment where there are interventionists and specialists and coaches to ensure that every one of the children in her care makes significant academic growth. Beyond that, content, I would say intellectual curiosity, a drive to always get better at one's craft as a teacher. Outside of those kinds of things, there are teachers who are really strict. There are teachers who aren't. There are teachers who are really warm. There are teachers who present as being sort of stiff or cold. Those things are not the key determinants of student learning or of, in my view, excellent teaching. I do think that children need to feel zealously supported in classrooms, regardless of whether what a teacher's other personality characteristics might be.
And the second part to the question that I wanted to ask, and again, this is a little separate, in dealing with teacher retention, let's set aside COVID. Obviously, it's difficult because that's the time we're living through. But in a regular year, what are the stats on, say, charter school retention of teachers versus public school retention of teachers? And
usually higher in charters. And I don't know, I don't have statistics nationally or state or district jobs. Again, in New York, typically, for example, are unionized. And that means a few things. One of which is that there usually are a long since negotiated set of things like retirement benefits and healthcare coverage and tenure. So teachers are very hard to dismiss in most unionized contexts if they're underperforming. I won't go into the politics of the details of it, but I think it's generally fair to say that it's really hard to fire teachers or to sit them down and say, this will be your last year working with us. We want you to finish up the year, but we're not inviting you back next year. In charter contexts, if folks aren't able to show growth, and hopefully they're supported and developed in a way where they can grow, but if they're not able to demonstrate that growth and they're low performing as teachers, they will typically not be invited back the next year. Which is very different from a lot of district contexts where teachers can stay. Some charters turn over more of their teachers, some less. Some do a great job holding on to folks. Some are able to hire with a lot more. One way to think about this is like any marketplace, any employment marketplace, there are if you think about law firms or hospitals or businesses, there are places that have a lot of turnover and places that have a little. Some of it has to do with who you're hiring. Some of it has to do with, once you've hired them, how you support them. But charter, this is probably available, these kinds of data from a bunch of different sources, but I would venture generally charter school teacher turnover is going to be higher than district. The sector as a whole, again, as we said earlier, 3 to 5 years, a lot of folks leaving the profession in all kinds of schools.
Right. Um, One of the things that I think people, I'm sure a lot of people do focus on, but
Yeah.
is a little concerning, regard just in terms of education, is the fact that we stress a lot of what goes on in the building, the education building. So whether it be a public
Yeah.
school or a charter school, it doesn't really matter.
Hmm.
But we don't seem to kind of give as much grant as much importance to the home environment that a student comes from, the um, kind of the education that goes on at home, the
Right.
stress on doing your homework, or or having books in the house, or
Hmm.
a multitude of things. How do Is there a way that schools can address some of these issues and some of these inequalities? Because obviously, if you're, a middle class family or a higher income family, you're more likely to have more books in your house. And
Oh, there's
uh,
studies of the number of words that a child hears by age 1 or 2 in homes where parents have a higher level of education or more resources versus the absence of those things or a lower level of those things, and the differences are staggering. So this is one of the reasons why the issue, for example, of testing 4-year-olds for admission into kindergarten gifted programs is so complex. Are you being tested on some notion of intrinsic intelligence and giftedness, or are you being tested on what your first 4 years of life were like and what you were exposed to at home and in preschool and the like? Their schools can't serve as the perfect leveler of those differences. What they try to do, good schools and good teachers and good educational leaders, is to ensure that those differences don't become dispositive of a child's future. So we have children coming in, for example, to kindergarten who can read, and we have children coming in who don't recognize letters yet or numbers. I mean, so just right there, you can see that if that goes unaddressed, you may have children who are on very different trajectories right out the gate of public school. But children are also sponges at a young age and are able to learn a lot. We're all able to learn a lot actually at any age, but particularly in those early years. And so uh, I think that some of that also relates to what kind of partnership schools forge with families. Are you in touch with a child's parents or guardians? Are you giving them not only the areas where their child is struggling and suggesting ways in which they can help at home, but are you praising the child and saying what they're doing great in? I mean, that can be really reinforcing to a family in terms of building a relationship of trust with the school. But those differences can be very significant, for sure,
mhm.
in home life.
Yeah. Again, to pivot a little bit, when kids eventually leave um, Hebrew Public, or
Hmm.
just at whatever stage, whether it
Yeah,
be elementary school, middle school.
right.
Do you have high schools? I'm sorry.
We don't yet. We hope to someday. We actually just briefly on this. We manage 3 schools in New York, 2 in Brooklyn and 1 in Harlem. We're opening a school in Staten Island next year. We also manage a school in Philadelphia, and then we have a network of schools that we help to launch and that we support, but we don't run directly, in Los Angeles and Minnesota, East Brunswick, New Jersey, Washington D.C., and San Diego.
Wow. Um, so what values do you hope that kids leave your
Mhm.
school with?
I mean, it's the Olam values I mentioned before,
Hmm.
that they are, well, just say it again, outstanding problem solvers, lifelong learners, aware communicators who are making a difference in the world and in their communities. And there's a lot that sits under that, but values of curiosity, open-mindedness, skills of critical thinking and problem solving, an orientation towards communication and working with people together, bridging differences. they're learning another language, they're learning about another place. We have an 8th grade trip to Israel for the children in our program. Um, but I think it's this idea that they're also in schools, and we haven't talked about this. Our schools are very diverse by design. We're a member of an organization called the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition, of charter schools that were specifically designed to help counter segregation. So in our schools, people get confused because of the word Hebrew in the name, but we serve children from all different backgrounds, and the particular mix of kids in a school varies a lot depending on the school's location, but they're all extraordinarily diverse.
And uh, why the decision to teach Hebrew and
Mhm.
rather than, I don't know, maybe some other specialty, or what, why Hebrew?
So one of the things about the charter school movement is charter schools were created with an eye towards experimentation and kind of a lab, right, for different kinds of school models. Hebrew is taught almost nowhere. So the idea of having a charter school, our founders, folks who preceded me in coming up with the idea for this network of schools, were really interested in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, and in the study of Israel, and in bringing that language into public secular contexts. So that was in the same way that in New York, there's the Hellenic Charter School Academy, which now actually has 2 campuses, one in Staten Island and one in Brooklyn. The founders were folks, Greek American citizens, who really were interested in bringing the Greek language into the public sphere more. So personally, I'm really, really interested in diversity in all forms, and that includes linguistic diversity. So while there are a lot of schools that teach Spanish or Mandarin, for example, as 2 currently popular ones, and of course French continues to be high up there, we love seeing schools that are teaching Greek and Turkish and Arabic and you name it, right? Japanese, and across the full range of district schools and charter schools in the United States, there's actually a lot of linguistic diversity, which is wonderful.
Um, what have you found to be the most difficult part of starting a charter school? And the and
Everything. Yeah. No, go ahead.
well, I'm sure the process,
Yeah.
is difficult, but is there something that sticks out as being the most challenging to you, or one of the most challenging parts of it?
Um, Facilities are a big issue. It's really depending on where one is located, but this has been true pretty much everywhere we've tried to open a school. Just finding a suitable facility and having that work financially in terms of space and everything else. Recruiting the initial group of families to the school. You're getting people to take a leap of faith on something brand new. Uh, and that's different than you move to a neighborhood and your child goes to the zone neighborhood school. That's your default setting, as it
Mm.
were. To choose to not do that and come to a school that hasn't even opened yet, that's another big one, I would say. We often can succeed, I think, more easily in finding wonderful people who want to start that school up in terms of school leaders and founding group of teachers.
Uh, why? Sorry, if you had to fix, it's difficult to ask one thing, right? If you had to, if you can wave a magic wand and make one big problem in
Climate
American
change.
education,
Go ahead. Sorry.
it's, yeah, I threw in
But
a
that's would be,
curveball.
yeah. Yeah.
In American education, what would it be?
Ooh, boy. Um, Probably I would if I could fix one thing, it would be teacher workforce. It would be, and maybe there's components to this, so forgive me, but I would wave the wand, and teaching, whether because of the way it's compensated or because the way society viewed it, teaching would be a highly competitive, highly valued profession. So in the same way that people might compete to go work at a big name law firm, or to get a job at Google, or to be a physician, that's how people would feel about teaching. And therefore, there'd be more people wanting to teach and more excellent people wanting to teach than there actually are spots. And when you have more supply than demand, and I'm not like a raging capitalist, but when you have more supply than demand, you can get a better quality workforce, more supply of people, in other words, who want jobs. Sorry, I actually got that backwards. More demand for teaching
Yeah.
positions than the supply of people of roles, of teaching
Yeah.
roles. So that's probably the thing I would change, because as important as the head of school is, as important as a lot of the different roles, if you don't have really good teachers, the rest doesn't happen.
Yeah, I forgot where I read this recently, but I think I'm probably going to mess this up, but it's some maybe in Korea, they view they pay educators a lot more than on average than American schools do. That's one, and two, they that profession is so revered that most people in college kind of want to go into that profession when they get out of college.
So there's
Because
certainly a cultural, right? Even aside from issues of compensation, there's a cultural component to this, of how are teachers viewed by a society.
yeah,
And I think in the U.S., depending on the community, the cultural group, the where in the country, what kind of school, teachers are held in more or less regard. I don't think there's a consistent low regard or consistent high regard. I think it's sort of all over the place. But I think it's fair to say they are not collectively held in the same kind of esteem as a lot of other professions. And teaching is a profession, just like social work. It happens to be a lower paid one, and that's part of the problem.
yeah, and I think because of the retention issue we mentioned before, the fact that teachers don't stick around for more than 2 or 3 years, I think
Right.
there is a tendency to maybe view educators as disposable or replaceable, and I think if we
Yeah.
can fix somehow um, that retention problem, and people actually did make careers out of being educators. They spent
And people still do. Let's
yeah,
be
yeah, no,
clear,
no,
right?
of course, of course.
People still do, and there are places where people can make a decent living teaching, and there are places where in addition you can get promoted. You teach for a certain number of years. Not only does your salary go up, but you can also take on roles of greater responsibility, or cross school or cross classroom responsibility. But yeah, I think that we have a substantial workforce issue in terms of our ability to attract folks to want to teach, and as you said, to want to stay.
Mhm. And maybe a tangential kind of question. What or who do you see as the greatest obstacle to providing quality education?
The greatest obstacle,
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about the teacher workforce.
Yeah.
I think I'd probably come back to that. Look, a lot of folks will say it's funding. um, I think that lots of things need more money. Right? We spend a ton of money on healthcare compared to every other country, but we don't spend it in the right places or on the right things, and so we actually have crappy outcomes in terms of public health compared to a lot of other countries that spend less. Similarly, there are places where we spend a lot of money on education, but don't have great outcomes. There are places where we spend less and have better outcomes. There's not a linear connection between money and outcomes in education, which doesn't mean that more money isn't needed. It just means that throwing more money at it isn't a solution in and of itself. Money needs to be spent carefully and strategically, uh, and aligned with the outcomes one is trying to get. So I really think structural changes in how we think about teaching, how we prepare people for teaching careers, reaching all the way back to high school, to start encouraging people and developing them and incentivizing them towards that career, where folks really see it as a path. Those changes, to me, that's the biggest obstacle, I think.
And then the final two questions I ask
Mhm.
of all my guests on every podcast.
Okay.
Um, I'll bundle them together and you can
I
answer.
should have watched one of the earlier ones. I'd be ready for these. Go ahead.
um, I hope they're not too difficult. The first question is what gives you hope for the future? And the second one is what are I try to say 5 books. What are 5 books on fiction or nonfiction that you would recommend to people? I thought that was always
Wow.
a fun one to add at the end.
Oh boy. Okay.
Mhm.
The book one I'm gonna actually have to pull up. I'm a little bit anal when it comes to books. I have an Excel spreadsheet that I've been keeping for about 25 years, where I write down every book that I read and author and the genre and the year I read it and all that sort of thing. I think people now use Goodreads for that, a
Yeah.
website. But starting with the first question, what gives me hope? Oh boy, I mean, it is a tough and dark time, right? Political fracturing, rise of untruth and new forms of untruths taken to all sorts of extremes through social media, climate change. I think probably science and learning and knowledge give me hope. Whether that is hope, optimism, that since human behavior is so hard to change and governments find it so hard to collaborate, that there'll be a technology breakthrough. I'm not holding my breath for this, right? We have to continue to work on climate change, but that there'll be a technology breakthrough that will help. The vaccines, right, are this incredible thing that was developed. They were developed rapidly off of decades of earlier research that have changed the course of the pandemic. As horrible as it still is, imagine how much more horrible it would have been. The number of people I know who have died and were unvaccinated, or who have thrived and survived despite catching COVID, in a breakthrough case because they were vaccinated. The ability for medicine and science and knowledge, when used thoughtfully and well, to improve the world, human conditions, and the conditions of the planet, that gives me hope. Although I think we're in a little bit of a race between the worst aspects of human behavior and the ability for knowledge well applied and ethically and morally applied to make things better. So books, The Power Broker is a book by Robert Moses. You may have read it as a history.
Robert Caro.
I'm sorry, Robert Caro,
Yeah.
about Robert Moses. Caro, who also wrote the Johnson biographies, which I've only read one volume of, but The Power Broker to me is like the best single volume history book or biography that I've ever read, just in terms of the workings of power and the sort of moral complexities of a great man and the ways in which he lost his sort of moorings morally while creating all of this change in the world around him. That's certainly on my list. I think recently, because the movie came out and I've read the book so many times, Dune by Frank Herbert, just in terms I'm a big fan of speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, the ways in which he envisioned such a radically different future and pulled on all these different elements of religion and sociology and history in our current world and in our past to think about that. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison was one of the first books that I read when I was much younger by an African-American author, and it was just so unbelievably powerful, and is on my short list to read again, actually, because of that. Let's see, what else? I may have to stop at 3 today. Mouse, the graphic novels by Art Spiegelman. I think in terms of finding a way for another genre to convey memoir and history and tragedy. I was an avid comic book reader when I was younger and still love good graphic novels, and Mouse just blew me away. I think that's 4. I'll stop there. There's I'm sure dozens of others that would be high on my list, but that's what I'll give you today.
I appreciate that you have a list you can reference in case you get stuck. Not everyone.
So part of it is I forget what I've read. I started reading a book several years ago, and I thought it seemed familiar. It wasn't until I was about 200 pages in that I thought to check my spreadsheet, discovered that I'd read it about 7 years earlier. So it's imperative for me that I keep track.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to speak with me.
It was my pleasure.
It was a real pleasure, and this is one of the most important topics to discuss.
For sure.
And I appreciate you taking some time.
Thanks for having me, Stanley. I really appreciate it. Take care.
You too.